Welcome to this session on soul music, which borrows, of course, the famous line from James Brown, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." After all, soul music is the genre, really, throughout a good part of the 60s that came to define musically black identity. There were other competitors, of course. Gospel music was still a strong presence in American life in general, and certainly in black life. Motown, of course, had its own image of what it was to be black and successful in America, and we talked about its project of assimilation. Soul music is a little more defiant than probably both those genres. There are certainly defiant elements of gospel that we could talk about in more detail later. But what soul music does is it absorbs elements of gospel, it absorbs elements of R&B, it absorbs elements of pop and even country sounds and so on, and forges them into a black identity that is based on not exactly separatism, but a kind of distinctualism, a kind of way in which one is laying out difference as a positive attribute, as opposed to how difference was often seen between white and black societies, which would be to the detriment of blacks. Soul music, in essence, grew out of the work of two men, Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. There are other ways we might have plotted our way through this, but I think that these are in many ways the two progenitors of what we tend to call soul music of the 60s. They were both active in the latter half of the 1950s, but they really reached cultural prominence in the 1960s. Over the course of that decade, soul music rose to be one of the most prominent genres within R&B and was the main focus of several important studios and musicians of that era, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Soul music is very much identified with Southern regionalism. It's considered a Southern regional style. It's not that it wasn't played throughout the country, but many of the prime artists came from the South or were at least deeply influenced by music from the South. So it's seen as both an anticipation of and then a response to Motown, right? Obviously, soul music predates Motown. But to the minds of many people who are interested in black music of the 60s, they become the sort of antipodal poles, right? So that on the one hand, you have Motown with its ideas of assimilation, its ideas of palatability and crossover success, and then you have soul music with its emphasis on distinctualism, its more abrasive sounds, and of course its less of interest in assimilation. So whereas early Motown is pop-based and mitigates racial difference by emphasizing pop sounds over racially marked sounds, soul music heightens racial particularity by highlighting racially marked genre signifiers, in particular gospel sounds. Indeed, a simple definition of soul music might be the infusion of gospel techniques, approaches to vocal delivery, instrumental timbres, long sections of testifying, ecstatic modes of expression, all of these elements, applying these elements to popular music. Some songs like Ray Charles's "I Got a Woman" from 1955 are just secular adaptations of sacred songs. Others, like "Stand By Me" by Benny King, were directly modified from recently composed songs in a gospel tradition. In this case, "Stand By Me, Father" by Sam Cooke and J.W. Alexander, written for the Soul Stirrers, and that was a gospel group that for a while Sam Cooke was part of, and then he left, but he continued to work with them, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So this mixing of the sacred and the secular was perceived by many within the church community and even by many notable musicians, including Big Bill Broonzy, who, upon hearing Ray Charles, cried out, "He's mixing the blues with the spirituals, he should be singing in a church." Many people saw this mixture of the popular and the religious as irreligious, and perhaps even outright blasphemous. Many soul musicians, like Sam Cooke and Aretha Franklin, got their start either in the church or in gospel performing groups, going pop and crossing over here in both the positive and negative senses of the term, was considered a risk and even morally suspect, right? So the audiences for gospel music were very protective, and they didn't really like people going outside of that realm, and we'll see that with Sam Cooke. Now, to give a little context of the era, of course, what we're talking about is by the middle of the 60s, soul music came to speak to a real need within the black community. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a major piece of legislation. It eliminated discrimination in public spaces and institutions. It forbade discriminatory employment decisions based on race, sex, religion, or national origin, and it made provisions to accelerate the desegregation of schools. It also made it illegal to deny hotel rooms and other such facilities based on race. And that was, of course, a major problem for touring musicians, right? If they would tour in the South, they didn't always have a place to stay. They'd have to sleep on their bus. That's why Duke Ellington, for instance, had his own train car, right? So that he always had a place to sleep. And his band always had a place to sleep when they wouldn't be able to get hotel rooms in the South. So it's a major piece of legislation, and it really can't be gainsaid how important it was. In short, this act, especially when coupled with the Voting Rights Act of the next year, of 1965, was the paramount achievement of the first long wave of the civil rights movement. So this is what it all sort of culminated in. And what it did is it ended de jure discrimination in the U.S. That is, discrimination would no longer be sanctioned by law, right? And here on the next slide, we can see the signing of the, I think this was the Civil Rights Act, not the Voting Rights Act. And you can see Martin Luther King Jr. is there. And this is a big moment, right? And I think it's appropriate that there's this photo op, because both of these men worked very hard for this piece of legislation. This is not legislation that happened under JFK. I don't think it's legislation that would have happened under JFK, even though Lyndon B. Johnson, for various political reasons, sometimes gave Kennedy credit for leading up to this moment. This was the work of Lyndon B. Johnson. He worked very hard on this legislation, but as much as he worked on it, so did Martin Luther King Jr. All of those years, little over a decade at this point of activity, of activism, of protests, of sit-ins, of speeches and attempts to reconcile black and white communities culminated in this moment. But the problem is that the law only does so much. In history, we tend to think of the laws as being these benchmarks for how society has changed, but the law only does so much. Let's see that on the next slide. So the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, they ended de jure discrimination. De jure meaning written into the law, right? So separate but equal. That's de jure discrimination, where it is legally binding that black people have one water fountain, white people have another water fountain, black people are on a certain part of the bus, white people on another, as regulations, as laws. That's de jure, right? Discrimination. But de facto discrimination is not that. And indeed, those laws, those pieces of legislation, they did not and could not end de facto discrimination, which is to say that they couldn't prevent discrimination from occurring in reality, despite the law, through traditions and attitudes that did not run directly afoul of the law. So you have a private business, right? It's not a public entity. You can decide to simply not serve black people. It's your private business, right? Eventually that will no longer be the case. The hotels, as you already saw, are no longer allowed to discriminate in that way. But there are other forms of discrimination that have nothing to do with the law, just attitudes toward people and so on. Because most of the discriminatory laws were state laws in place in the southern states, many blacks living in the north were already living in conditions that were absent of de jure discrimination, but rife with de facto discrimination. So this means that the Civil Rights Act had a relatively small impact on the lives of Northern blacks, despite the undeniable fact of its national importance. Many blacks felt that despite years of constant struggle, and despite being legally recognized as equal under the law, they were still not treated any better, still considered subordinate, still left behind. This opened the gates to a justifiable sense of resentment and indignant rage. And it was the kind of rage that at first Lyndon Johnson didn't understand, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. And so there are other important moments that are happening in the middle of the 1960s with respect to the civil rights movement. One of the most important, of course, is the 1965 assassination of Malcolm X. Remember that Malcolm X offered a alternative to Martin Luther King's Jr.'s vision of how black and white relations ought to work. Malcolm X, he his rhetoric changes over the course of his career, and he becomes more open toward reconciliation. But at first, he's really concerned with the idea of black protectionism. He famously says when Kennedy is assassinated that he sees it as the chickens coming home to roost, and this is part of what led to his alienation ultimately from the Nation of Islam. But for a long time, he was one of the Nation of Islam's most powerful speakers, and he came to represent a more combative, resistant vision of blackness and black political agency. There are moments throughout the 60s of civil unrest, civil protests. So the Selma March, of course, the Watts riots in LA, that's what the picture is of. That's the National Guard moving into the Watts neighborhood. Soon other race riots ensued, right? You had Chicago's Division Street riots in 1966, the first Puerto Rican riot in U.S. history. You had the long, hot summer of 1967 with riots in Newark, New Jersey, Atlanta, Georgia, Boston, Massachusetts, Buffalo, New York, Tampa, Florida, Birmingham, Chicago, New York City, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, New Britain, Rochester, Detroit, and Plainfield. The most destructive of these were in Newark and Detroit, right? And they destroyed large parts of property. In fact, so much so that those areas looked like war zones. Detroit was wrecked. Huge parts of Detroit and Newark were wrecked. And as we'll see in the next slide, LBJ put together a commission that would go touring these areas, and they described it as though they were bombed out cities in Vietnam. That's how they looked. And this was, of course, the Kerner Commission. Lyndon Johnson was both personally hurt and understanding about the civil unrest. In retrospect, he declared, "What do you expect? I don't know why we're so surprised. When you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years, and then you let him up, what's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off." So at first, he was, like I said, personally hurt by the whole thing. He said, "I don't know what anyone wants from me. I've done more in the few years that I've been president for civil rights legislation than anyone since at least Lincoln." Right? And he was right about that. He's not wrong. And but he comes to realize, as we just saw, that that's not exactly the point. That the legal shift creates a desire for a social shift. The shift in de jure discrimination creates a desire for the shift in de facto, because we can't help but think of those things as being intimately related, if not entirely correlated, and they're not. They're simply not. So what he does is he convenes the Kerner Commission to investigate the underlying causes of black unrest. They're basically a group of politicians and social scientists that are going to study this issue and figure out why this is still happening. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson feels almost immediately threatened by his own committee, right? This is somewhat typical of Johnson. He was a brilliant politician in some ways, but he knew how to sort of force people to do what he thought was best, and he was very interested in social programs. um, much more so than previous presidents have been. Um, and yet, at the same time, he sometimes got threatened by the people that he was trying to get to help him, to assist him in his causes, especially if he felt that they were going to gather any kind of um, popularity around themselves, or a sense of presence around themselves. So he sought to defund his own commission. He tried to take uh, the power out of it. Part of this had to do with John Lindsay, who was the New York mayor and was becoming a more and more powerful force in government, and was considering a presidential run, and all the rest. So he begins to be somewhat wary of this commission. But they wind up releasing their report anyway, despite various political wranglings, on February 29th of 1968, and they declare that the cause of the riots were white racism. And then ultimately, the structural situation, this is the beginning of talks about structural racism, right? The idea of that the way that society is structured is so uneven that it's impossible for any real sense of reconciliation until that's rectified. Here you see Otto Kerner giving a press conference, and then you have LBJ next to him. Here's some parts of the report. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Remember, this is after the civil rights legislation, so he's saying then that it's still separate and unequal. Well, what many white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. So even though white people don't live in the ghetto, one of the things that some social scientists believed that they would find was that the problems of the ghetto are intrinsic to the ghetto. And then it has to do with black mismanagement of their own neighborhoods and so on. But a lot of the people who own the buildings in ghettos are white people. The people who offer jobs at low paying wages and so on, and have discriminatory hiring practices, are often, not always, but often white people. So the problems of the ghetto have as much to do with white societies as anything else. That's what the report finds. The report recommended intense government spending to work to eradicate de facto segregation, but LBJ had Vietnam. He had already spent a decent amount of money on the civil rights legislation that he had already processed. He could hardly afford the programs the commission envisioned. They were very ambitious. I'm not saying that they were wrong-headed. They were just perhaps too ambitious for the financial situation. Now, had the U.S. simply withdrawn from Vietnam and stopped spending that kind of money, then who knows what would have been possible. But that wasn't going to happen at that point. Then you have the Nation of Islam, another factor in the racial situation of this time. So you have variants of the separatism of Marcus Garvey that were gaining traction. One was, of course, the Nation of Islam, which was started by Wallace D. Fard Muhammad in Detroit in 1930. And then by 1934, it was under the direction of the charismatic Elijah Muhammad, who created specific places of worship and strongly encouraged black business establishments. So in this sense, he's not only influenced by Marcus Garvey, but also by Booker T. Washington. Under his leadership, the Nation of Islam became largely separatist in its ideology, to the point where Elijah Muhammad even proposed the idea that white people were a sort of failed scientific experiment, and therefore weren't original humans in that sense. Which is why he sometimes refers to them as white devils, and that becomes part of the sort of lexicon. Malcolm X was a key spokesperson for the Nation of Islam before he departed from it in 1964, partly owing to his comments about the assassination of JFK. Then he was murdered a little over a year later. That year is a remarkable year in the life of Malcolm X, and it would be worth talking about in greater detail That's when he visits Mecca. That's when he becomes more attached to the Muslim religion outside of the Nation of Islam. Um, and so he changes his ideas a lot in that last year. Now, whether that contributed to his assassination is hard to say. Some people still believe that Elijah Muhammad may have been behind his assassination. Other people believe that it was perhaps funded by the government. He was clearly under a great deal of suspicion from the FBI and so on. It's hard to say. Then you have the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael adopts the term Black Power to political ends. The term actually goes back to the 1920s, and maybe even earlier. But he begins using it as a real slogan, a political slogan. The term itself first appeared in a more widespread manner in a 1954 novel by Richard Wright, the famous author of Native Son. But Carmichael uses it in a speech before the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, on June 16th of 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi, after the shooting of James Meredith, which was a major moment in the civil rights movement, where a man who was doing no one any harm was there for the March Against Fear, was shot, right? So the March Against Fear turned into a situation that inspired a great deal of fear. And what Carmichael says is, this is the 27th time I've been arrested, and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we're going to stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. What we're going to start saying now is Black Power, right? So keep in mind that he's one of the heads of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group that was founded through the inspiration of Martin Luther King Jr. And now he's taking a much different stand, right? A much more defiant stand. And that characterizes a lot of the things that are happening over the course of the 60s. And we'll see how soul music plays into that. In October of 1966, that's the founding of the Black Panther Party by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. And you can see Huey Newton in the middle there. Bobby Seale over toward the right. They created an army of citizens, basically, of citizen patrols intended for cop watching, right? The idea was that as white policemen were policing black neighborhoods, they often abused black citizens, sometimes in the course of arresting them, sometimes just for casual, who knows why, not even when they were arresting them, just harassing them, right? And so having the armed presence of black people, and you can see Bobby Seale's in kind of the uniform there. They wear the black jacket, often a leather jacket, and the beret. So you see these people that are dressed alike. They seem to be a sort of informal army. They're carrying, it's illegal. They're doing this in places with legal carry laws, but they're carrying large guns. Sometimes light machine guns and so on. It's intimidating. And the idea is that they're not interfering with the police, but they're watching what happens. They also created free breakfast programs and health clinics, right? So they were really trying to improve the situation in the ghetto, the situation in black communities. They had numerous violent clashes with the police. Most of them they did not instigate. A few they did. By 1969, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, considered them the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And so he created what's called COINTELPRO in response as an effort to infiltrate and destroy the Panthers, right? The last person, the person I didn't mention, the one all the way to the left, that's Eldridge Cleaver. He's another very interesting figure within the Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement. He was not originally part of the movement. He's sort of brought in later, in part because he's a fairly famous author at this point. But he winds up creating his own faction in contradistinction to Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And of course, Huey Newton is put in jail for a long period of time So the Black Panthers, they don't stay as cohesive as they might have, and they wind up fracturing into these different factions, different with different goals and different visions for what they should be doing. So let's return to soul music and see how this plays into that situation. Sam Cooke got his start in 1950 with the older and established gospel group, the Soul Stirrers. We mentioned them before. He was replacing their highly influential and celebrated singer, Rebert Harris, who quit because he felt a deep moral contradiction within the notion of a popular music group touring on gospel songs. So already you can see with Harris this concern that gospel and popular music just cannot be reconciled. So Cooke first recorded with them on the song Jesus Gave Me Water. He was much younger than the rest of them, and they were somewhat suspicious of whether or not he could carry the day. But he's a very charismatic singer and performer, and he soon proved to them that he was up to the challenge. And that was in 1951. That was on the Specialty label. Now, it was a decent success for a newcomer and a rather young singer in gospel. By 1956, managers and record labels, including Atlantic, which was Ray Charles' label, they were asking Sam Cooke to try to succeed in pop music, right? Now, he resisted this at first, because at gospel audiences, as I intimated before, they were fiercely loyal, but they were also very protective. And they saw any attempt to cross over as a betrayal. Think of Mahalia Jackson, for instance. She never sang, even though she was offered the opportunities throughout her career, she never sang popular music. The closest she came was singing semi-religious music by figures like Duke Ellington. But like I said, it was semi-religious music. She sang, it was part of a cantata that Ellington had written. So she resisted throughout her career, right? And that was considered part of her reputation, that she was pure in that sense, that she didn't sully what she was doing with the music of the devil, to put it in sort of stereotypical terms, right? So Sam Cooke is very concerned about this. He doesn't want to lose what he has, but he becomes convinced, in part by this man, by J.W. Alexander, who was another gospel performer and a songwriter and an A&R man, right? Artist and repertoire man, which means that he would find artists who were in repertoire and put them together, basically, material. So he would find songs that would work well for certain singers, and he'd find singers that would work well for certain songs. Well, he recommended to Cooke that he give it a try, and Sam Cooke trusted J.W. Alexander, as we'll see. They had a very long-standing relationship. And so the Alexander also convinced Art Roop of Specialty to record some pop sides, because again, Art Roop was not, he didn't want to take that chance. Art Roop was, he would take a chance on newcomers, but once he had you established, he didn't want you to change too much. He figured he was going to ride that out as far as it could go. But he gave the assignment to Bumps Blackwell, and Bumps Blackwell was much more experimental, innovative, risk-taking. He had worked with Little Richard and other up-and-coming artists already, and so he tries to apply some of that to Sam Cooke. The first single was a song called Lovable in 1957 under the name of Dale Cooke, right? And this was in a vain effort to hide his identity. First of all, the name's still Cooke, right? But second of all, Sam Cooke's voice is inimitable. You recognize it immediately. There's no mistaking it, right? So everyone knew that Lovable was by him. And it sold fairly well. But Root became upset with Blackwell's attempts to transition Cooke into a full-blown pop artist. Lovable was one thing, because Lovable wasn't overly sexualized. It was, it was a fairly innocent song. But this idea that Bumps Blackwell was going to really push Sam Cooke into being a true pop artist. What wound up happening is Root walked in one day when Blackwell was having Cooke sing some pop tunes, right? And so the gospel audience, they weren't too crazy about Lovable. They didn't hate it, but they didn't love it. It didn't sell. It didn't cross over in that sense. That song mostly sold to pop audiences, whereas his other music was selling to gospel audiences. So Roop didn't really want to lose his investment. And when he came in and he heard Sam Cooke singing a bunch of popular tunes, he got angered. And so he fired both Blackwell and Cooke. But Blackwell said, "You owe me all sorts of money." And they settled for the rights to the 8 songs that he had been recording with Sam Cooke that Art Roop didn't approve of. And that's how they ended their contract, right? Because Art Roop owed Bumps Blackwell a decent amount of back royalties. So Blackwell and Cooke, they go to a small label named Keen Records, and they release the song "You Send Me." This was the one that really pissed off Art Roop, right? He thought that this one was way too pop. Well, he made a bad choice because that became a pop #1 and an R&B #1. So a true crossover hit in 1957. It's at the top of both charts. And several more crossover hits followed, including "I'll Come Running Back to You," "Only 16," and "Wonderful World." Cooke had 30 top 40 hits between 57 and 64. Highly successful. Notice that on "You Send Me," you have the Bumps Blackwell Orchestra, right? That wasn't a full orchestra. It was just studio musicians. But this was another way of Bumps Blackwell getting his name on the front cover, because not all producers did get their name on the front cover of a record, right? But Blackwell was becoming so important that he was becoming a celebrated producer. So having his name there would help sell the record. J.W. Alexander founded his own publishing company called Kags Music around 1957. And this was in an effort that's J.W. Alexander, by the way, all the way to the left. And then, of course, you can see Sam Cooke. At any rate, he founded his own publishing company in an effort to get a greater share of the profits. He was a songwriter, but relied on the record company to provide publishing, and he found he wasn't making as much money from the songs. He would get the writing credit, and that was it, not the publishing credit. But why should they get it? They didn't do any of the work. So he created his own publishing company, and he would talk to other artists about maybe coming into business with him, established artists like Fats Domino. And he tells this story that's fairly funny, that Fats Domino just kept laughing. He was trying to tell him about all of these ideas, and Fats Domino's like, "Man, why do you want to waste your brain space with stuff like that? That's why you have agents. That's why you have publishing companies. You're busy touring. You're busy writing songs. Why would you waste your time with that? It's pennies on the record." But those pennies add up. So Sam Cooke hears about this, and he asks to have a lunch meeting with J.W. Alexander. They're already friends. He sees Alexander as kind of an advisor anyway. And he's an up-and-coming star, obviously, Sam Cooke. So he says he wants in, and they become business partners. So what they wind up doing, the first thing they do is they hold an audit of the books at Keen Records, and they found that they were being ripped off. So they sued, right? They got a high-class lawyer, and an accountant, and they really examined things closely. They found all the ways in which the company was hedging money from them, and they sued to recoup the losses. That wound up bankrupting Keen Records. It wasn't a very big record company, and it couldn't withstand the lawsuit. So Cooke signs to RCA Victor, and RCA Victor, of course, is not a small company. It's a major company, and they knew right from the beginning that they were going to have their books audited on a regular basis, because Sam Cooke retained the accountant, and even for a while made the accountant and then the lawyer his agent. So he was looking, he wasn't interested in an outside agent that was going to find him gigs. He was finding gigs fine on his own. He was interested in someone who was going to watch over those contracts and watch over the money. And he gained the hit, of course, with Chain Gang, which was a pop #2 in 1960. Meanwhile, Alexander and Cooke started their own record label. So he's recording on RCA Victor, a huge record label, but they start their own, SAR, which is just Sam and Alex Records. They recorded the Soul Stirrers and other gospel groups. So that was their main niche, was gospel music. In 1964, Cook hires the music business accountant Alan Klein, the guy that looked into the Keane books, to negotiate a new contract with RCA, gaining Cook a higher percentage of the profits and greater artistic control. And Klein becomes his manager, and his career moved into a more serious phase. So he's moving away from some of the more ephemeral pop songs and the things that he thinks are going to have a little more staying power. One of the things that Klein does for him is he gets him a gig at the Copacabana. Now, the Copacabana is basically a white club in New York City. Very few black artists at that time had played there at all. And so it was considered a real breakthrough for Sam Cooke to not only perform there, but to have entire nights that were dedicated just to him. And so they released the album Ain't That Good News, January of 64. And played and recorded at the Copa in New York City as an attempt to appeal to an even wider audience. And he was doing a mixture of sort of nightclub tunes and then his own tunes. And he was singing his songs basically as though they were nightclub tunes, right? Live at the Copa, which was released in 64, was hugely successful. It's considered one of the most influential soul albums, alongside James Brown's Live at the Apollo from 1963. So 2 live albums, right? And part of that is, when you listen to Live at the Copa, you'll hear that Sam Cooke, first of all, that voice is amazing even live. But secondly, you'll hear the banter with the audience, his sort of the ease with which he interacts with them. Some of it is almost a little cloying, a little much, but you can imagine how he's able to connect with largely white audiences without feeling like he's compromising himself. He's not acting like he's in a subservient role by any means. He's speaking to them on their level, and yet at the same time there's something a little bit ingratiating about the whole thing, just because of I don't know, just this nightclub kind of banter, which you can hear if you listen to the album. But it was a highly successful album. A Change Is Gonna Come was released after his mysterious murder on December 11th, 1964. It's not really possible to figure out what exactly happened. The stories conflict. Apparently, he went home or went to a hotel room with a young woman, and he claimed, or seems to have claimed, that she had robbed him. The hotel owner, who may or may not have been in on that robbery and in on the whole thing, said that he became violent and was attacking them. That seems pretty out of character for Sam Cooke. And he was shot and killed. This song, A Change Is Gonna Come, an amazing performance. Even if you only listen to the first 10 seconds of it, as soon as you hear that voice enter, and the string arrangement is great. It's one of the great albums or singles of this period. It becomes a civil rights anthem. It was inspired, in fact, it was intended to be that. It was inspired by Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind. Sam Cooke wanted to write a song that he felt had that same kind of protest vibe to it that fit the civil rights movement. So it was a conscious effort to do that. Then you have Ray Charles, an Atlantic Soul. Charles signed with Atlantic and had an immediate R&B hit with It Should Have Been Me in 1954. And then I Got a Woman in 1955. His first crossover hit, though, was What I'd Say. What Did I Say? What Did I Say? Which was a pop 6 and an R&B number 1 in 1959. It was a double single. It was a double single not because there were 2 songs, but because the same song was on both sides of the record, right? So it was an extended song in that sense. It sort of fades out on one side and then comes back in. The second side is the side that didn't always get played on the radio. It's the more obviously sexual of the two, because it's the part where he's going back and forth with the backup singers, and he'll go, and then they respond, and he goes back and forth, So you'll listen to it. But these grunts, almost as though they're engaging in sexual activity. Uh, he supposedly improvised the song sometime in 1958 during a gig, just to fill time. Right, they were out of their set list, and so he just improvised a fairly straightforward gospel sounding, gospel tinged blues tinged piece. Um, so he blends the gospel elements with sexual innuendo, and the song was banned from several stores and radio stations. A lot of places wouldn't play it and wouldn't sell it. He left Atlantic in ABC for ABC in 1960, and he had hits with his very famous rendition of "Georgia on My Mind." That was a pop #1 and a R&B 3. And then he wins the Grammy for that song as well, and then Hit the Road Jack, which was a true crossover, pop #1, R&B #1. Then in 1962, he releases the album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, which was sometimes called Ray's Folly, because ABC thought there's no way that this is going to sell. Keep in mind that the 60s were not a great decade for the popularity of country music anyway. When country music was becoming more sort of segregated from the rest of the market, it had fewer crossovers. It was more traditionally minded. Now, what he's doing in recording these songs, most of the songs he's recording are from the 40s and 50s, right? So he's going back toward the more popular era of country and western music, but he's doing these songs in a R&B fashion, in a gospel tinged fashion. His single "I Can't Stop Loving You" was a pop #1 for 5 weeks and an R&B #1 for 10 weeks, so it was a huge hit. And I noticed that it doesn't go on the country charts because country was by and large uninterested in crossover phenomena at that point, right? But it was a hit. It's a country music hit, or at least singing country music in a more or less in an R&B style. But doing this led to a pop and a R&B hit. He said he was interested in country music for the stories, right? That part of the reason that a lot of people venerate country music, especially of the era that he was covering, the 40s and 50s, is the stories that it tells. And those stories come across well in that album. It's a remarkable album. He had a follow-up to it, which wasn't nearly as good, but the first one is amazing. Now, Atlantic has stayed in the soul music business. They don't stop just because Ray Charles left. And really, the maintenance of Atlantic comes through Solomon Burke. He really kept them afloat. He replaced Charles and is credited with coining the term soul music because he didn't want to be known as an R&B singer. He felt that because he was a religious singer and got a start as a religious singer, that R&B was too much of a sellout. So he's looking for a way to deal with the criticism of gospel audiences, right? So this is soul music. Yeah, it's popular, but it's still involved in the church in some way. He had a fairly sizable R&B hit, R&B #7, Pop 24, with Just Out of Reach of My Two Open Arms. That's one of his signature songs. He has a less restrained approach than some other singers. He's perceived as being closer to the African American roots than, say, Sam Cooke. Everybody Needs Somebody to Love was a minor hit, Pop 58 in 1964. It's a great tune. And Tonight's the Night, Pop 28, R&B #2 in 65. He kept Atlantic solvent, really. He kept Atlantic from going under from roughly 1961 to 65 when they had a resurgence of interest in their label in 65. Then you have Stax Volt Records, one of my favorite producers of soul music. They're sort of Motown's messy competitor. They're originally a white-owned company, but they were created by the founders Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. Founded as Satellite Records in 1957 as a side business. They're brother and sister, and so they did this as a side business. I'm trying to remember what Stewart's main job was, but I think it might have been sales, door-to-door sales, maybe even. But he was dissatisfied with it. And so they created the side business, and he was obsessed with recordings. He made this little recording studio in his garage, and his sister really enjoyed music and enjoyed the idea of promoting music, and so they tried to record a few acts from a variety of different genres in the area, right? Stewart himself played country music, and so some of the earliest recordings on satellite records were basically sort of bluegrass and country, with Stewart playing bass, I believe. But then they met Chips Moman, who became their staff producer, and he was really interested in R&B. And in the summer of 1959, they recorded Fool in Love by the Veltones. And this was picked up for national distribution by Mercury Records. So they were just creating records. They didn't know how to, they didn't have the network to distribute them. But Mercury Records is a pretty big deal. So the fact that they wanted to distribute Fool in Love bode well for them. So they moved their studio. They decide, maybe we better not record out of the garage anymore and get a better studio. So they find an old abandoned movie theater at 926 East Macklemore Avenue in Memphis in late 1959. It was a huge space. This is the outside of it. You can see that it stacks there. It says Soulsville, USA, obviously mimicking Motown's Hitsville, USA. It was a huge space, and they divided it. It was too big. It was too echoey. Chips Moman knew they weren't going to get a good sound out of it. So they divided it in half. They took out the seats. They put in a lot of sound absorption material. And they divided it in half so that on the one side they had a recording studio with a relatively booming sound, owing in part to the sloped floor. Remember, this is it's a movie theater, so you have the sloped seating. And this created a pretty distinct sound, a kind of strange sound. You can always tell when you're listening to a Stax recording, even when it's a non-Stax artist, because some artists who weren't part of Stax Records, part of their roster, they would record there, and you can always tell once you get used to hearing it. But on the other side of the building, they had a record shop, which Estelle ran. And that was credited as the key to their understanding of what sold well, because they sold not only their own records, but they sold whatever records were popular, as long as they were R&B records, R&B and soul records. So Estelle would talk with all of the record distributors, oh, what's selling well. I know what's selling well here because I'm selling it, but what's selling well in other parts of the country? And they would talk, and she would take notes, extensive notes, right? And they would sort of gauge, okay, well, what do you think makes this record successful? And plus, while she's doing this, because she's having long conversations with record distributors who are kind of lonely people, they're going from town to town, trying to sell their records, trying to get them placed in stores, checking on numbers and so on. So she's making relationships with these people, right? So they're going to help her distribute records that they record. They're keeping... allowing her to have her finger on the pulse of the industry. It was a smart marketing move. She really paid attention to what was going on, not just locally, but throughout the nation. One of the first recording artists in this new situation, when they're in Macklemore Avenue, is the father-daughter team, Rufus and Carla Thomas. They met Rufus Thomas. He just kind of walks in one day. He sees that they're building something. He takes a peek in, and he just introduces himself. He was a local DJ. You might remember Rufus Thomas if you were in my class last semester. He had that Answer song, which was basically a ripoff of Hound Dog, called Bearcat, where it was the same exact tune, just he's saying Bearcat instead of Hound Dog, and making cat noises instead of dog noises. But at this point in his career, he's kind of not too happy with Sam Phillips. He didn't feel like Sam Phillips helped him that much with his career. That Sam Phillips was much more interested in Elvis Presley and all the white artists. And he becomes a radio DJ. But he wants to get back into recording. He feels like that's what he deserves, a recording career. But he also has a very talented daughter named Carla. So he records a duet with his daughter called "'Cause I Love You" at the new studio. It was picked up by Atlantic, who soon drew them into an exclusive contract. And this was a mistake for Stax Records to allow this to happen. But basically, Atlantic signs them, but they want them to continue to record at Stax Records. And they became so now Estelle and Jim Stewart, Estelle Axton and Jim Stewart, they decided to make this into Stax Records. Notice Stewart, Axton, Stax, right? So they changed the name to Stax Records in 1961, and they had the motto R&B market first, pop second. So they were less interested in crossover. It's the exact opposite of Motown, if you remember. Motown was interested always in pop number ones. If you remember, I said that Berry Gordy got rather upset whenever the Supremes had a number 7 hit, and he hit the roof. He thought that all the Supremes recordings should go to number 1. So they were meant to be a pop sensation. But for Stax Records, they're interested primarily in R&B. And so they're thought of as being a little more authentic, and certainly more gritty, more soulful, all of those things. You have Booker T and the MGs. The Stax recordings or Stax Records. They continue to record Carla Thomas, but her songs are appearing on the Atlantic label. They then record the Marquis, who were originally the Royal Spades, and their instrumental hit "Last Night," which was a 3 pop, 2 R&B in '61. And this was on their own label, on Stax Records. This group transformed to become the studio's house band, and they become Booker T and the MGs. And that's Booker T. Jones, Steve Cropper, the guitarist, Donald Duck Dunn, and Al Jackson Jr. And then they're often coupled with the Memphis Horns, so they developed the Memphis sound. Green Onions, which was a pop 3 R&B number 1 in 1962. That's one of their most famous instrumentals. If you listen to it, you'll immediately recognize it. It has that funky bass, the clean but gritty guitar, prominent organ, hot horns. Steve Cropper also replaces Moman as the producer and A&R man. Sometimes Isaac Hayes replaced Jones as the pianist and worked as a songwriter along with David Porter. And so Isaac Hayes and David Porter become 2 of the staff composers at Stax. Stax creates a series of subsidiary labels. They have an incredibly unorthodox and non-hierarchical method of recording. So there are no written arrangements. They basically just have the musicians, singers, and producers. They all collaborate on head arrangements. They don't write anything down. They just say, hey, let's try this, let's try that. Everyone gets input. Everyone helps with the mixing. There's not that same kind of division, which makes the recordings a little messy at times. They make them experimental at times. They make them so that it's much less rigid. It takes a little more time, but there's something special about these recordings. To avoid suspicions of payola, Stax Records had subsidiary labels including Volt, Enterprise, Chalice, Suffice, and Hip, right? This was to avoid concerns that DJs were playing too many songs from the same label, because if a local DJ or national DJ was playing one Stax song after another, then people might think the fix is in. And after the 1960 payola hearings, congressional hearings, there was a lot of worry about the notion that somebody might be succumbing to payola. Wilson Pickett, between 1965 and 67, the roster for Stax grew from 12 to 100 acts. Wilson Pickett was signed by Jerry Wexler to Atlantic Records, and he sent them the Stax to record in 65, and he records his most famous hit, In the Midnight Hour, which features a delayed backbeat. Listen carefully to that backbeat, and you'll hear that sound. That's part of what contributes to its sound. So notice he's on Atlantic, but Atlantic is using Stax Records because they're getting such a good sound, so they're sending several of their artists there. Otis Redding quickly becomes the star of the label. He's not on Atlantic, he's on Stax. He joins in 1962. His first single was These Arms of Mine in that year. And then every single, 17 of them, were released by Redding during his lifetime, entered the charts. So every single he released entered the charts. June of 1967, he's at the Monterey Pop Festival, which we'll talk about in greater detail later. December 7th, 1967, he releases Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. December 10th, he died in a plane crash. So Sitting was his first pop number 1 hit. And he had huge success with crossover audiences at the Monterey Pop. So who knows what would have happened with his career had he not died. But one of the great recording artists of that period. Another group on this label is Sam and Dave. Well, they're not on the label. They're, again, an Atlanta group that are leased to Stax. That's a little different than being on. They were leased to Stax. The relationship between Atlantic and Stax Records gets very complicated, and as you'll see in the next slide, it soon ends. But Sam and Dave worked with David Porter and Isaac Hayes as songwriters, and they released a series of great hits. You don't know that you don't know like I know in '66. Hold on, I'm coming, and then Soul Man, both from '67 and both major hits. In 1968, Stax breaks with Atlantic as the latter is being bought out by Warner. As Warner Brothers buys out Atlantic, they, of course, review the books. Stax gets to see some of the books, and they figure out that he didn't own many of the recordings he made through his deal with Wexler and Atlantic. He didn't read the contract carefully enough, right? Unlike Sam Cooke, he didn't hire a high-class lawyer. And so he didn't read the contract carefully enough. Jerry Wexler was a fairly canny businessman, and he ripped him off. So a lot of the songs that they had recorded that they thought that they owned the masters to, Atlantic owns the masters. So Stax is determined not to get ripped off again. So the company becomes an independent label, releases some important albums, especially by Isaac Hayes, which we'll discuss later, but then dissolves in disarray in the early 70s. They don't last very long. Then you have Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. They were founded in 1967 by a rhythm section, the Muscle Shoals Sound Rhythm Section, sometimes called the Swampers. Right? That's Barry Beckett on keyboards, Roger Hawkins on drums, Jimmy Johnson on guitar, David Hood on bass. They performed at Fame, the Florence, Alabama Music Enterprises studio. Wexler was having more difficulty with Stax, as we saw. Jim Stewart only wanted to record artists on his label, so he turned to Fame Studios. And Wilson Pickett went from Stax to Fame. Aretha Franklin was sent to Fame Studios by Jerry Wexler, and they are recording there before Atlantic Records. Franklin signed with Atlantic in '67 after falling out with Columbia Records. She didn't do very well at Columbia. She releases her first hit, "I Never Loved a Man," which was a pop #9 R&B #1 in 1967, and then she had 13 #1 hits over the next 5 years, so a huge career. And of course, her version of Respect, which was originally a Otis Redding tune, became a huge hit for her. And you can hear how great the band at Fame is if you listen to that track. It's a very familiar track, but listen carefully to the backing band. It's an amazing performance. Then, of course, we have James Brown, 1955. James Brown and Bobby Bird's sister, Sarah, performed in the Gospel Starlighters, then joined Bird's group, the Avons, which became the Flames, and he signed to Federal Records in Cincinnati, a sister label of King Records. He released Please, 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 his first single in 1956, and that became #5 R&B. Then he's touring with Little Richard, and he filled in for Little Richard when Little Richard left music in 1957, so he finishes the tour as the headliner. In 1958, he has his first #1 R&B hit with Try Me. Now he's on King Records, the main record label, but he's having trouble with the president of King Records, Sid Nathan. So he records songs on different labels under a pseudonym. He's a hit in the South, but he only makes an impact nationally with the album Live at the Apollo, which is an amazing live album, 1963. Nathan refuses to release it, or he tries to. So Brown finances the thing on his own, and the album wound up on the pop charts for 14 months, peaking at at #2, which for a black soul album, more or less independently produced, huge success. So he forms his own production company called Fair Deal in order to promote his music to white audiences. Now with he's now recording with Smash Records, which is a subsidiary of Mercury. And he has 2 major singles in '65. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which is the one that you should study. And then I Got You. And in 1966, he has a hit with the ballad It's a Man's World. Man's World. In 1967, he releases Cold Sweat, which is one of the first true funk tunes, and we'll talk about that one we'll talk about funk later. Mother Popcorn's released in '69. He's got Jimmy Nolan on guitar, Maceo Parker on sax, and soon he'll have Bootsy Collins on bass, and we'll see that on the next slide. In 1968, he more or less stops the riots in Boston that probably would have followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. There were riots throughout the nation, but the mayor of Boston has a very good idea. He makes the concert for James Brown free, right, to audiences, so people come to hear James Brown for free. He's being paid by the mayor, basically, and he gives an amazing performance, and he kind of talks the crowd down from violence and from open rioting. The song "Say It Loud," "I'm Black and I'm Proud," is a pop number 10 and an R&B number 1 in 1968, and that just demonstrates that there is a crossover potential for these songs of a more defiant nature, right? And then in the 1970s, like I said, we're going to talk about this in a later session, the JBs, including Bootsy Collins, have a series of funk hits with things like Get Up, I Feel Like a Sex Machine of 1970, and Get Up off of that, a later hit. So we'll talk more about funk music and several singles in a later section. That's it for this one.